"Look, it's the bread beggar mechanic," shouted a boy in the square. Everyone laughed as Marcos, his hands stained with grease, held tightly onto the bag of bread he had received as payment. His heart tightened, but he did not reply. He simply lowered his head and walked on, carrying what little dignity he had left. Marcos, 68 years old, lived in a makeshift workshop in the backyard of his small house. His hands, full of calluses and scars, were proof of a life dedicated entirely to work. There, surrounded by the smell of burnt oil and worn-out tools, he found the only place where he still felt respected, among engines and gears. He never had much, but he had never stopped being honest. A widower for more than 10 years and without children, he found in work the only way to fight loneliness. He accepted any form of payment, money when someone had it, or food when they didn't. A bowl of soup, a bag of rice, or even a piece of stale bread was enough to fill his stomach and give him the strength to keep going. To the townspeople, this was a reason to mock him. For Marcos, it was survival. Despite the constant humiliation, his reputation as a mechanic was unquestionable. Cars that modern shops abandoned, he managed to revive. Many said his hands were magical, though few truly valued what he carried inside. The problem was that outside his workshop, no one saw that gift. On the street, he was just the old bread man. Some even called him a beggar, as if his honest exchanges were shameful. Marcos never answered back. Silence was his defense. He had learned over his lifetime that the strongest reply to contempt was to keep working. Deep down, he believed his dignity was worth more than their laughter. At night, he thought of his late wife. She always said, "Dignity is not in your pocket, but in your heart." Those words were his shield against the storms of humiliation. But loneliness weighed heavier each day. The town seemed determined to push him lower, as if he had no worth. Still, he clung to the little he had, his tools, his sweat, and his honor. Marcos knew people saw him as a defeated man. But he also knew that even in poverty, he carried a wealth no one could take away. What he didn't know was that his life was about to be turned upside down, and humiliation would follow him to his greatest moment. "There goes the grease beggar," shouted a group of young men in the square, pointing at Marcos as he carried a sack of rice in his arms. The laughter filled the air, cutting through the quiet afternoon. Marcos kept his head down, as always, and walked on, though his heart was heavy with shame. In the small town, Marcos was a constant target of cruel comments. Gossip spread quickly, always dripping with contempt. "He trades work for scraps," some said. "He's a failure," added others, as if there were nothing funnier than ridiculing a poor man. At street corners, it was common to see someone mocking him, hunched and covered in grease, receiving a piece of bread as if it were treasure. The laughter filled the air, as though his misery was everyone's entertainment. Marcos pretended not to hear, but inside, every word cut him deeply. His soul carried invisible scars, carved not by heavy labor but by the daily humiliations he endured. He always chose silence. He knew that if he replied, the mocking would only grow. So he swallowed his pain and repeated quietly to himself, "As long as I have my hands, I am still a man of dignity." One day, as he received a bag of rice as payment, 2 boys shouted, "Look at the mechanic of the cheap plate." The laughter was so loud it echoed down the street. Marcos simply lifted his eyes to the sky, as if asking for strength to endure. The children didn't spare him either. "Hey, stale bread man," they shouted when he walked by. Marcos forced a weak smile, but inside he felt the wound open once again. Despite it all, some still respected him. Humble people who understood the value of honest work would say that without Marcos, they couldn't keep their cars running. To those few, he was essential. But they were the minority. The weight of the laughter was far heavier than the quiet respect. The whole town seemed to delight in his poverty. Still, Marcos did not give up. He stayed firm in his routine, believing that a man's worth was not in others' judgment, but in remaining faithful to himself. And amid all the cruel laughter, he would soon find small gestures of kindness that would reignite his hope. "You even take bread as payment? What a disgrace," shouted a neighbor when he saw Marcos receiving a bag from the bakery. Laughter echoed down the street. But something different happened that day. A child's voice rose above the mockery. It was Julia, Rosa's granddaughter. Doña Rosa was a simple woman who always paid Marcos with fresh bread. She had no money but plenty of gratitude. Each time she handed him the bag, she smiled with respect and said, "Your work is worth more than gold." For Marcos, those words meant more than any coin. Julia, only 10 years old, looked at him with eyes full of admiration. To her, Marcos wasn't a beggar, but a hidden hero. She often sat nearby, fascinated by his patience and dedication to every repair. While the town ridiculed him, Julia defended him fiercely. "He's better than all of you," she shouted at the mockers, leaving even Marcos surprised. The people laughed louder, calling her the granddaughter of the bread mechanic. But Marcos, touched by the girl's courage, smiled for the first time in a long while. In the midst of cruelty, there was at least one pure soul who believed in him. Doña Rosa also suffered the neighbors' scorn, but never stopped supporting him. "Let them talk, Marcos. Those who laugh today may cry tomorrow," she would say, trying to ease his burden. At the workshop, Julia sat quietly in a corner, watching him work. She admired how he treated every piece as important, even when the car seemed beyond repair. In his hands, she saw a gift no one else possessed. Marcos, embarrassed, would tell her she should dream bigger. But Julia insisted, "When I grow up, I want to be like you." Those words filled the old man's heart with a strength he thought he had lost. Little by little, the girl became his comfort in loneliness. Her presence lit up the dark workshop like sunlight. And though he was still the target of cruel jokes, Marcos no longer felt entirely alone. In Julia and Rosa, he found proof that his work mattered. What he didn't know was that the girl's admiration would be the very pillar that held him up in his darkest hour. "Everyone look, the beggar mechanic is being paid with bread," shouted Ricardo, the arrogant businessman, in front of the crowded square. Laughter burst instantly, rolling over Marcos like a wave. Holding the bag of bread, he felt shame burn deep in his chest. Ricardo was known for his wealth and pride. Owner of businesses and luxury cars, he believed himself above everyone else. To him, poor men like Marcos were nothing but failures unworthy of respect. The scene unfolded when Rosa handed the bread to Marcos. A humble gesture, meant to be kind, was twisted into a spectacle of humiliation in Ricardo's hands. "Working for bread is the mark of a miserable man," he jeered. The people laughed harder, some even clapping as if it were a show. Marcos stayed silent, clutching the bag to his chest, struggling to hold back tears in front of the crowd. Julia, furious, tried to defend him. "He's much better than you," she cried, but her voice was drowned by the roar of laughter. Ricardo only laughed louder, mocking her innocence. Marcos felt the ground vanish beneath him. Each laugh was like a stone hurled at his heart. And though he said nothing, the pain he carried that day would stay with him for a long time. From then on, the humiliation spread through town like wildfire. The story of the bread mechanic became a joke whispered at every corner, giving everyone license to mock him. Some customers stopped seeking him out, too ashamed to be seen paying with food. To them, it was safer to spend more at another shop than to risk being ridiculed. Alone, Marcos thought of giving up. "Maybe they're right," he muttered in his empty workshop. But then he thought of Julia and Rosa, and his heart found enough strength to keep going. That day's public humiliation was the most painful of his life. But it was only the beginning of a long path of scorn, tears, and dignity. And without knowing, that very scene in the square would one day become the prelude to his redemption. "It's unbelievable that a man would stoop so low as to work for food," Ricardo scoffed in front of his friends at a bar. "While I drive luxury cars, that filthy old man kneels for a piece of stale bread." Laughter filled the room, feeding his arrogance. Ricardo was infamous for his pride. He liked to boast that he had built his empire with his own hands, though everyone knew he had inherited his fortune. Even so, his wealth gave him power to trample over those he considered beneath him. Marcos always avoided him. He knew Ricardo was the type of man who valued no one but himself. Still, fate had a way of forcing their paths to cross again and again. The town treated Ricardo like a king. Wherever he went, people flattered him, praised him, and held him up as a model of success. With every bow and compliment, his arrogance grew. To Ricardo, Marcos was the perfect punchline. He represented everything Ricardo despised: poverty, humility and dignity without riches. A pathetic failure, worthy only of pity, he declared openly. Yet not everyone agreed. Some quietly admired Marcos and saw his worth, but none dared challenge Ricardo. Fear of retaliation silenced their voices. That night, between toasts and laughter, Ricardo made a promise. "I'll ruin that old man. He'll never have the courage to show his face again." His words fell like a sentence passed down. Meanwhile, Marcos worked alone in his dimly lit workshop, unaware of the storm gathering over him. His hands were blackened with grease, but his mind was elsewhere. Julia and Rosa, worried, tried to comfort him. "Don't listen to them, Marcos," Rosa said. But deep down, even she feared what Ricardo was capable of. Marcos sighed deeply, wiped the sweat from his brow, and went back to work. "My worth is in my hands, not in what they say about me," he whispered, as if convincing himself. But the truth was undeniable. Every cruel word echoed inside him, slowly eating away at his soul. And the worst was yet to come. "Look, everyone! The beggar mechanic is getting alms!" Ricardo's voice thundered across the crowded square. All eyes turned to Marcos, who stood frozen, clutching a bag of bread. Laughter burst around him like fire. Ricardo stepped closer, a smirk on his lips. "Working for bread proves you're worth nothing," he shouted. The people roared, their laughter turning the moment into public entertainment. Marcos tried to reply, but his voice faltered. Shame burned through him like fire under his skin. His chest heaved, and he thought he might collapse under their mockery. Rosa rushed forward, desperate. "He's honest. He works hard to survive," she cried. But her plea was drowned in the sea of laughter. Julia, enraged, grabbed Marcos's hand. "Don't listen to them, Grandpa," she shouted bravely. Ricardo only laughed louder, mocking her innocence and courage. Silent, Marcos pressed the bread bag against his chest. Every laugh was a blade cutting his dignity. He didn't cry, but his teary eyes revealed the depth of his pain. The scene spread through the town in hours. The bread mechanic was humiliated in the square. They gossiped at every corner. Once again, Marcos became everyone's favorite joke. Many customers stopped going to him, afraid of being associated with the laughingstock. To the town, Marcos no longer had honor. That night, alone in his workshop, Marcos finally broke down. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am worth nothing," he whispered, staring at his grease-stained hands. But deep inside, his wife's words echoed. "Dignity is not in your pocket, but in your heart." That phrase was the only rope holding him above despair. And while others celebrated his downfall, fate was quietly preparing a moment that would reveal who Marcos truly was. "Did you hear what happened yesterday?" Old Marcos was called a beggar in front of everyone, a woman said at the market. And the worst part? He didn't even answer, just stood there like a stray dog. Laughter followed her words as others joined in. Within hours, the story spread across the town. What had happened in the square became gossip in bakeries, cafes, and on street corners. The bread mechanic, they called him now, as if it were a funny nickname. To Marcos, each word was a knife. The next day, when he walked through the center, whispers followed him. "There he goes, probably to pick up more bread," they sneered. He pretended not to hear, but inside he felt the whole town had turned against him. Even some customers began to avoid him. They were ashamed to pay him with food, afraid of becoming a joke themselves. It was easier to spend more elsewhere than to be linked with Marcos. Back at his workshop, silence weighed like iron. The tools were there. The smell of oil was the same, but the sound of cars arriving was gone. It felt as if his dignity had vanished along with his work. That night, Marcos stared at his hands, rough and calloused. These hands have given so much. Why do they now receive only contempt? He whispered. The silence around him was unbearable. Julia, indignant, promised in secret that she would always defend him. But Marcos feared for her. He didn't want the little girl to carry the same ridicule he endured daily. The town had made up its mind. Marcos was nothing more than a broken man living off disguised alms. That was the image spreading like wildfire. But what no one knew was that soon, this same man, mocked and despised, would become the center of a story that would silence them all. Because life has a way of testing the humble when they least expect it. And here, dear reader, you must ask yourself, how much humiliation could you endure before breaking? Marcos's journey was only beginning to reveal his true strength. "Hey, grease beggar, lend me some change too," mocked a passerby outside the workshop. Marcos, hunched over an engine, lifted his eyes but said nothing. He sighed deeply. Insults had become part of his daily routine. That night, silence at home was deafening. Marcos sat at his bare table with only a piece of hard bread in front of him. He looked at it with mixed feelings: gratitude for having something to eat, and pain for being mocked because of it. Memories of his wife returned vividly. He remembered how, when younger, he dreamed of opening a proper workshop. She had always supported him, reminding him that what mattered most was never losing his dignity. Now, alone, he wondered if he still had any left. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm worth nothing," he whispered. Tears fell onto the bread, soaking it like proof of his defeat. Yet deep in his soul, a fragile flame flickered. He thought of Julia, the little girl who defended him without fear. If a child could believe in him, shouldn't he also believe in himself? Marcos wiped his tears with grease-stained hands. "As long as I have these hands, I can still fight," he murmured, trying to convince himself. But the echoes of laughter haunted him. Every insult, every chuckle weighed like a stone tied to his chest. That night he dreamed of his wife again. In the dream, she whispered, "Dignity is not in the pocket, but in the heart." He awoke with a heavy chest, but also with a faint spark of hope. He knew darker days still awaited, but he also knew life always finds ways to test those with the least. And you, reader, how far could you endure humiliation before giving up? It's in that fragile space between shame and dignity that true strength is born. Because sometimes, at rock bottom, the power no one expected finally awakens. Look at her. Now the little girl is defending the bread beggar too, mocked a boy at school, sparking laughter among his classmates. Julia, Rosa's granddaughter, stood tall, her face red but unafraid. "He's worth more than all of you put together," she shouted. Her words even surprised the teachers who tried to calm things down. But Julia refused to back down. To her, Marcos was a hero, no matter how much the town treated him as a joke. She couldn't bear to see him mocked. On her way home, she found Marcos sitting at the door of his workshop, staring into the distance. She sat beside him and took his hand. "They can laugh, but I know who you really are," she said with teary eyes. Marcos tried to smile, touched. "You shouldn't waste your energy defending me, little one. I'm old and used to this." But Julia shook her head firmly. "No, you are a man of value, and I won't let them treat you like trash." Those simple, pure words touched Marcos more deeply than any payment could. For the first time in ages, he felt that someone still truly believed in him. Rosa, worried, cautioned her granddaughter, "Julia, be careful. They'll mock you too." But the girl answered firmly, "Better to be mocked with him than stay silent." Marcos quietly wiped away a tear. The courage of that child made him rethink everything. If a 10-year-old could stand up to them, why should he bow his head? That day, something shifted in his heart. Marcos realized he wasn't entirely alone against the world. Yet he feared Julia might suffer for standing with him. He didn't want her to bear the pain he carried. Still, he couldn't deny it. Her words lit a spark inside him, a flame of hope he thought was gone. And that flame would be what kept him standing when the humiliation reached its darkest point. "My car never breaks down. Only poor men's junk does," Ricardo boasted to his friends, showing off his luxury vehicle in the square. They laughed, feeding his arrogance. But fate doesn't forgive arrogance. One stormy night, Ricardo was driving back from a business trip when his car began to sputter. The engine coughed, lights flickered, and within minutes the vehicle died in the middle of a deserted road. Ricardo tried over and over to restart it, but nothing. He cursed, kicked the tires, and slammed the wheel. He called his friends, but no one answered. His phone battery was nearly dead. Rain poured harder, soaking him through. For the first time, the arrogant man felt helpless. No amount of money or power could save him from that moment. Suddenly, an old truck pulled over. The driver checked the car quickly and said, "Only one man in this town can fix this, Marcos, the mechanic." Ricardo's face drained of color. The very man he had mocked so cruelly was now his only chance. Still, his pride snapped back. "I'll pay anyone else, whatever it costs." The driver chuckled. "Pay all you want. No one fixes engines like him. Call Marcos, or stay stranded." Out of options, Ricardo had to swallow his pride. With the trucker's help, he returned to town and sent an urgent message. He needed the man he once called a beggar. The news spread like wildfire. Ricardo begged Marcos for help, people whispered. By nightfall, a crowd had gathered, eager to witness what would happen. Marcos heard the message with surprise and doubt. His chest tightened at Ricardo's name. "Him? Asking me for help?" he muttered. Julia, excited, exclaimed, "It's your chance to show everyone who you really are." But Marcos only sighed. He knew it wouldn't be so simple. Fate was leading him back to the very square where he had suffered his worst humiliation. But this time, the ending would be far greater. "Look, Ricardo the Mighty, begging the bread beggar for help," a man shouted in the square. A crowd had gathered, buzzing with anticipation. Marcos walked slowly, every stare weighing on his shoulders like a stone. Ricardo stood stiff, arms crossed, trying to look composed. But his tension betrayed him. His luxury car sat dead in the center of the square, surrounded by curious eyes and mocking whispers. As Marcos approached, the murmurs grew louder. "Will he agree to help?" some asked. "Or will he get revenge?" others whispered. The old mechanic kept silent, though pain filled his eyes. Ricardo swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he forced out the words. "I need your help." The phrase echoed like thunder. The crowd erupted in laughter, savoring the irony. Marcos lowered his head, breathing deeply. The scene was a nightmare. His entire town gathered, waiting for his answer. A part of him wanted to refuse. Another part remembered his dignity was not in vengeance but in staying true to himself. "Go on, Marcos. Show him who the real beggar is now," someone shouted, sparking cruel applause and laughter. Julia ran to Marcos and clutched his hand. "Don't listen to them. Do what your heart tells you," she whispered, her eyes shining with faith. Ricardo, ashamed, dropped his gaze. For the first time, the proud businessman stood small before the man he had once trampled. Marcos lifted his head and faced the crowd. "I don't fix for money. I fix because it's my work. And that doesn't make me less of a man than any of you." His words struck like hammer blows. The laughter faded into uneasy silence. People began looking at him differently. And then, in front of all, Marcos stepped toward the car. What happened next would change everything. "Look, the beggar accepted. He'll kneel again for a scrap of bread," someone shouted. Marcos closed his eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and dropped to his knees before the car. The stone pavement pressed cold against his legs. The crowd howled with laughter. Each chuckle was a dagger. Yet he didn't stop. His hands, scarred and covered in grease, began to work the engine with steady precision, as though the world around him didn't exist. "Watch. He'll finish the job and then beg for soup," jeered a young man. The square roared louder. Ricardo stood silently, shame burning his face. Then out of nowhere someone hurled a piece of hard bread at the ground beside Marcos. Laughter exploded even harsher. "There's your payment, beggar," the man yelled. Marcos froze. Tears welled in his eyes. For a moment he considered walking away. But then he remembered Julia, Rosa, and his wife's voice whispering, "Dignity is in the heart." Slowly, he picked up the bread. He didn't eat it. He didn't throw it back. He simply placed it by his side and kept working. The crowd fell quieter. What seemed like humiliation began to look like unshakable strength. His silence cut deeper than words ever could. His hands moved with calm mastery. Every twist of the wrench was a cry of defiance against years of scorn. Minutes later, the engine roared to life. The car started again, echoing through the square. The laughter vanished into stunned silence. Marcos rose, holding the bread high. His voice trembled but rang clear. "As long as I have my hands and a piece of bread, I have everything I need." And at that moment, the entire square realized they were not witnessing a beggar, but a man unbroken, He did it. The car is running, someone whispered, breaking the heavy silence. The engine roared loudly, but no one laughed anymore. All eyes were fixed on Marcos, the old mechanic who had done the impossible. Marcos stood tall, bread in his hands, tears shining in his eyes. His body was weary, but his dignity burned brighter than ever. For the first time, the town saw him not as a beggar, but as a man of honor. Ricardo couldn't meet his gaze. The pride that had fueled him his whole life had collapsed in front of everyone. Before him stood not a beggar, but a man who had risen higher without ever raising his voice. He endured everything, and still helped. A woman whispered, wiping her tears. Others lowered their heads, ashamed they had once joined in the laughter. Julia ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. "I knew you could do it," she sobbed. Marcos stroked her hair gently, realizing her faith had been his true strength. Ricardo remained frozen, his eyes clouded. The crowd turned to him, waiting for his response, but his tongue was trapped between shame and fear. Marcos looked at him calmly. "You don't need to say anything. I didn't do it for you. I did it because this is my work. My worth is not measured by your money, but by my honor." His words struck the square like thunder. Slowly, hesitant claps began. Then the sound spread, growing into an applause that filled the air. The noise of hands clapping replaced the cruel laughter that had haunted him for years. Respect bloomed where mockery once ruled. Ricardo's knees buckled. Overcome, he sank to the ground. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice breaking. The crowd gasped in disbelief. And there, in the very square where Marcos had been most humiliated, he now stood as a symbol of unshakable dignity. "I wronged you, Marcos. I wronged you before them all." Ricardo wept, his voice cracking like a child's. The man once feared for his arrogance was now on his knees, begging forgiveness from the one he had despised. The crowd watched in silence, tears streaming down many faces. Those who once laughed now shrank in shame. No one had ever seen Ricardo like this. Marcos lifted the bread high, his voice firm. "You laughed at me, called me a beggar, but look, while I have my hands and a piece of bread, I have everything I need." The words pierced every heart. Silence broke into sobs. That simple truth weighed heavier than gold. Ricardo's body shook with sobs. "You are more of a man than I will ever be," he admitted, tears soaking his face. The once proud businessman had nothing left but remorse. Julia clung to Marcos, smiling through her tears. "I always knew you were special." The old mechanic squeezed her hand, grateful for her faith. One by one, neighbors approached. "Marcos, forgive us for laughing at you," one man said, head bowed. Others echoed the plea, their voices thick with guilt. Marcos answered softly, "I hold no grudge. We all make mistakes. But remember, what makes a man great is not what he holds in his pocket, but what he carries in his heart." Applause erupted across the square. This time it was not mockery, but respect. The old man they had ridiculed was now their teacher. Ricardo remained on his knees, his tears flowing without end. But in those tears was more than shame. It was the beginning of his redemption. And Marcos, hands stained with grease and bread held high, stood as the true victor. The square still trembled with emotion. No one saw Marcos as the grease beggar anymore. They saw the man who had turned humiliation into honor. His image holding up the bread would remain forever etched in memory. Ricardo, broken by remorse, swore publicly never to mock the humble again. The proud man who once lived by arrogance now discovered the weight of humility. Rosa, with tears in her eyes, hugged Marcos tightly. "You won, my friend, and you won without hurting anyone," she said, her voice trembling. Julia, proud and radiant, never let go of his hand. From that day forward, Marcos was respected in the town, not for wealth, not for titles, but for the greatness of his character. People who once mocked him now sought his advice and wisdom. His story spread beyond the village. Strangers came from afar to meet the man who had turned shame into glory, and all who left carried a lesson they would never forget. Marcos never changed his essence. He remained humble, still accepting food as payment when needed. For him, nothing mattered more than living honestly. Inspired, Julia once told him, "I want to be like you, strong in heart and in hands." Marcos smiled warmly, knowing his legacy was safe in her. The man once mocked in that square now received embraces, gratitude, and tears. What once was pain had become victory. His final lesson echoed in every corner. What makes a man great is not what he has in his pocket, but what he carries in his heart. The applause that filled the square that day was eternal. Marcos had become more than a mechanic. He was now a symbol of dignity. And if this story touched your heart, remember, never judge a person by what they own, but by who they are. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and keep walking with us through every lesson of life.